The stagecoach brake screamed, a sound of metal giving up against the drag of the mountain. Clara Hayes felt the final lurch in her bones, a jarring halt that sent her satchel tumbling from the hard slat bench. For 6 days. The Wyoming Territory had rattled her teeth and bruised her hips, and now it had deposited her in the thick churning mud of Hollow Ridge. The driver, a man who had spoken perhaps 10 words since Cheyenne, threw open the door. "End of the line, ma'am." Clara gathered her things, her movement stiff with cold and exhaustion. She carried little. One worn leather satchel held her few personal effects, a change of clothes, a brush, and the small, silver-framed likeness of her late husband, Robert. Her other bag, heavy canvas, was filled with books, Shakespeare, a worn primer, a Bible, and a thick volume of botany. Lastly, clutched in her hand, was the letter. It was a single, creased page from the county school board, her name and assignment a sharp black script against the white paper. It was her only anchor. She stepped down onto the board sidewalk, her black wool skirt, already faded from new, gathering a rim of dust at the hem. The town was 3 dozen buildings, half of them false-fronted saloons and gambling halls, staring at each other across a wide river of mud that served as the main street. The air smelled of wet pine, horse manure, and the sharp tang of wood smoke from 100 chimneys. It was raw, unfinished, and deeply unwelcoming. She had been a widow for 8 months. The fire had taken Robert, their small rented home in Ohio, and the child she had carried for only 4 months. It had taken everything but her breath. This posting, this harsh, remote place, was not a choice. It was an escape. It was the only place that would have her, a woman with no husband, no family, and no money. The stares began immediately. Hollow Ridge was not a place accustomed to unescorted women. Men in canvas trousers and worn hats stopped their work, their eyes lingering, assessing. A group of prospectors lounging on the porch of the Golden Nugget Saloon fell silent, their gazes heavy and unwelcome. Clara pulled her shoulders back, her spine straightening with a practiced defiance she did not feel. She was not indecent. She was a teacher. She walked toward the largest building, Miller's Mercantile, which also served as the post office, and, she assumed, the center of town business. As she passed the saloon, one of the men, thick-chested and smelling of stale beer, tipped his hat far too slowly. "Evening, ma'am," he drawled, though the sun was barely past noon. A mite late in the season to be traveling alone. His eyes were not polite. They were hungry. Clara inclined her head once, a curt, dismissive gesture, and kept walking. She heard a low chuckle behind her. Inside the Mercantile, the judgment was quieter but just as sharp. 2 women, their arms full of dry goods, stopped talking mid-sentence. They looked at Clara, then at each other. Their eyes slid over her worn black dress, the dress of a widow. Yes, but also the dress of a woman who worked, a woman who traveled without a man's protection. They saw her independence not as strength, but as a failure, perhaps even a scandal. Mrs. Miller herself, a woman built like a grain sack with a face soured by prairie wind, gave Clara a look that measured her from her worn boots to her bonnet, found her lacking, and turned away to address another customer. Clara waited, invisible, for a full 5 minutes before she cleared her throat. "Excuse me, I am looking for Mr. Silas Croft." The store owner, Mr. Miller, a thin man in a green visor, finally looked up from his ledger. "Mr. Croft ain't here. He's at the land office, but he's the one handles the school board." He gestured vaguely down the street. She found Mr. Croft in a small, cramped office that smelled of ink and dust. He was a small man, lost behind a large desk covered in maps and ledgers. He read her letter, his finger tracing the county seal. "Aya," he said, not standing. "We were expecting a teacher. Didn't expect, well, you're Clara Hayes." "I am." He leaned back, rubbing his chin. "The thing is, Mrs. Hayes, the town school is full. Mrs. Peterson handles the town children. Been doing it for 2 years. Clara's stomach tightened. But my letter, it says Hallow Ridge. It does. It does. He shuffled papers, avoiding her gaze. There is the new assignment, the one the county funded. He pulled out a map. The forest school. It's about 5 miles out, north of here. A forest school. Settlers in the valley. He explained quickly. 4, maybe 5 families. They got children. They deserve schooling same as anyone. So we built 'em a schoolhouse. Brand new. And a place for the teacher to stay? She asked, her voice quiet. Oh, there's a cabin right beside it. Old trapper's place, but it's sound. Got a stove. He finally met her eyes. And she saw pity. Or perhaps just exasperation. Look, ma'am, it's remote. I won't lie to you. The last one, a young fella from back east, lasted 2 weeks. Said the quiet got to him, and the wolves. He paused, then added, and there's rumors of outlaws using those woods. Men who don't care for the new railroad or the law. Mac's gang, mostly. Just rumors. Mind you, but no one else would take the post. Clara looked down at her hands. She had $2.30 in her purse. She had nowhere else to go. Running from grief had led her here, and she could not run any further. When do I start? She asked. The journey was silent. Mr. Croft had paid a young man named Jeb to take her out on a buckboard with her trunk and supplies. Jeb said not one word, his eyes fixed on the tree line as they left Hallow Ridge and climbed the narrow, rutted track into the pines. The air grew colder. The tall trees, pine and spruce, closed in, swallowing the sky. The silence was immense, broken only by the clop of the mule's hooves and the creak of the wagon. After an hour, they broke into a clearing. It was small, perhaps an acre, carved from the dense forest. On one side stood the schoolhouse. It was new, as Mr. Croft had said. The raw pine planks smelled sharp and clean, and the single window glittered in the weak afternoon light. Beside it stood the cabin. It was not new. It was old, built of logs grayed by 100 winters. It was a trapper's lean-to, left to rot and then reclaimed. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney. Jeb must have come by earlier to start a fire. He unloaded her trunk and her sack of supplies, flour, salt pork, coffee, beans, onto the small porch. That's it, he said, his first words. He did not look at her. Stream for waters down that path. Woods are full of game, if you can shoot. Thank you, Clara said. He just grunted, climbed back onto the buckboard, and turned the mule around. Clara stood alone, listening to the wagon creak away until the forest swallowed the sound. Then there was only the wind, whispering through the tops of the pines. It sounded like a sigh. She pushed open the cabin door. It was one room, a rope bed with a straw-stuffed mattress in one corner, a cold iron stove in the other, a rough-hewn table and one chair. The floor was packed earth. It smelled of mildew, cold ash, and something animal. She spent the rest of the day in a flurry of motion, because to stop meant to think, and to think meant to be terrified. She scrubbed the floor. She aired the mattress. She unpacked her books, setting them on a plank shelf. A small piece of home in this wilderness. She started a fire in the schoolhouse stove, warming the small room against the coming night. Her first night was sleepless. The forest was not quiet. The wind moaned. Branches scraped the roof like fingernails. She heard the distant, mournful howl of a wolf. And then an answer, closer. She lay on the thin mattress, her eyes wide open in the dark, clutching the small, cold likeness of Robert. She had never felt so alone. The children came 3 days later, 4 of them, 2 boys and 2 girls, walking single file from a homestead deeper in the valley. They were shy, with wild eyes, clutching a shared slate. The oldest, Eli, was maybe 10. The youngest, Beth, was 6. They were rough, their hands chapped, their clothes patched, but their eyes were bright with curiosity. Clara began to teach. She taught them letters, the A and the B, drawing them on the large slate at the front of the room. She read to them from her own books, her voice filling the small, pine-scented room. By the end of the first week, 5 more children had come, their families hearing by word of mouth that the new teacher had not, in fact, been eaten by wolves or run off. She settled into a routine. She rose before dawn, hauled water from the stream, and started the fires. She taught from 9 until 3. The afternoons were for chores, mending, baking hard bread, and chopping wood. She slept in the old cabin, isolated and wary. The heavy bolt on the door her only comfort. The town of Hallow Ridge seemed 1,000 miles away. She was an outcast, pushed to the margins, but here, in this small clearing, she was needed. It was on the second week, a cold Tuesday, when the quiet of the woods began to feel different. She was splitting kindling, the rhythm of the axe a comfort. Thwack, split, thwack, split. The air was still, too still. She stopped. The axe held low. She heard it, a crack. It was not the sound of her axe. It was not the sound of a squirrel. It was the sound of a heavy boot on a dry twig, somewhere deep in the woods, just past the stream. She froze, scanning the wall of trees. The pines were thick, their shadows long and dark in the late afternoon. She saw nothing. Then, a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from another shadow, dark gray or brown, gone before her eyes could properly focus. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice sounding small and thin. There was no answer but the wind. She grabbed her armload of wood and hurried back to the cabin, her skin prickling. She told herself it was a deer. She told herself it was a trapper checking his lines. She told herself she was jumpy, a lone woman hearing ghosts in the trees. She chalked it up to her nerves. But she double-checked the bolt on her door that night, and she kept the axe by her bed. The feeling of being watched did not leave. 3 evenings later, the sun was bleeding out, staining the snow-dusted peaks purple. Clara was running low on water. She hated going to the stream at dusk. The shadows were deceptive, and the cold was sharp. But she needed water for her morning coffee and to wash the slates. She grabbed the 2 wooden buckets, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The path to the stream was slick with pine needles. The water ran fast and cold, making her hands ache as she dipped the first bucket. She was filling the second when she heard the voices. Not whispers, loud, male voices, thick with drink. "Well, look what the forest coughed up." Clara stood up, her heart leaping into her throat. 3 men. They were blocking the path back to her cabin. She recognized one from town, the one who had watched her from the saloon. His name, she'd heard, was Mac. He was a large, broad-shouldered man with a tangled beard and a woolen shirt stained with food and tobacco. His eyes, even in the twilight, were lit with a cruel, drunken amusement. The 2 men with him were younger, hangers-on, one thin and nervous, the other one mean-looking and silent. "Good evening, teacher," Mac said, taking a step closer. He smelled of whiskey and unwashed bodies. "Gentlemen," Clara said, forcing her voice to remain steady. She held the buckets, the cold wood biting into her palms. "Please let me pass. It's late." "Oh, it's late," Mac mocked, grinning at his friends. "But we just got here. We heard there was a new teacher. We're just being neighborly." He took another step. "It must be lonely for you, way out here, a pretty thing like you, all alone." "I am not lonely. I am busy," Clara said, stepping back, her heel hitting the soft bank of the stream. The nervous one laughed. "She's busy. Mac." "What's a pretty thing like you doing teaching brats?" Max said, his voice losing its playful edge. He was close enough now that she could see the yellow in his teeth. "You should be in town, in the Golden Nugget. A woman like you could make a lot of money." "I am not that kind of woman," she said, her voice shaking now. "Oh, I think you are," Max said. He reached out and grabbed her arm. His grip was like a steel trap. "I think you're just the kind of woman who needs to be taught a lesson herself." The silent one moved to her other side, cutting off her escape. They were cornering her against the stream. "Let me go," Clara whispered, terror making her voice raw. Mac lunged, his other hand reaching for the collar of her dress. "We just want to be friendly. Teacher!" Clara screamed. A sound like a hawk's wing beat cut the air. Thud! An arrow, black-fletched and deadly, buried itself 6 inches deep in the pine tree, precisely between Mac and his nervous friend. The wood of the tree vibrated. The arrow hummed, a low, lethal sound in the dusk. The men froze. Mac let go of Clara's arm, as if her skin had turned to fire. He stared at the arrow. It was close enough to have parted his hair. He looked at the black, silent woods. "What in the hell?" the nervous one whispered, his eyes wide. Mac said nothing. He stared into the darkness, searching. There was no sound, no movement, just the arrow, quivering in the tree trunk. A silent promise. The forest itself seemed to be watching. Mac grabbed his friend by the arm. "Let's go, now!" They did not walk. They ran, crashing through the underbrush, slipping and cursing as they scrambled up the bank and disappeared back toward the main track, the way they had come. Clara did not move. Her breath was trapped in her chest. The buckets were spilled at her feet, the water soaking into the pine needles. Her arm throbbed where Mac had grabbed her. She stared at the arrow, then at the impenetrable darkness of the woods. Who? What? The terror returned. Different this time. She was not being attacked, but she was not alone. She ran. She fell on the slick path, scrambled up, and did not stop until she slammed the cabin door. She fumbled with the bolt, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries. It was a thin piece of wood, hardly a defense. She shoved her writing desk against the door, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She sank to the floor in the dark, her back against the rough logs, clutching a cold iron skillet from the stove. She did not light a lamp. She sat there, shaking, as the cabin grew cold, listening to the silence of the forest. She was unaware of the watcher, the one who had saved her, or that he was still there, high above, in the cradle of a massive, ancient pine. Elias watched the cabin door shut. He did not move. The longbow was still light in his hand, but his heavy, oiled rifle rested against the trunk beside him. He had watched the stagecoach arrive in Hollow Ridge weeks ago. He had watched her walk through the town, small and defiant, a blackbird among crows. He had seen the town turn its back. He had watched her come here, to this cabin, his cabin, once, years ago. He watched her teach the children. He watched her chop the wood. He watched her struggle, and he watched her endure. He had seen the men arrive. He knew Mac. He knew what he was. Elias settled his weight, the movement silent. The winter branches framed the small cabin below, a single point of fragile light. His face, visible only to the moon, was a ruin of old scars. The left side of his jaw and neck puckered and burned from a fire he had barely survived. The world had presumed him dead for 10 years. He had preferred it. He knew he should move on. Melt back into the mountains. This woman, this teacher, she brought the world with her. She brought trouble. But he had seen her face when Mac grabbed her. And he had seen the arrow fly. He could not leave her. Not yet. He watched the cabin, his mind torn between stepping forward into the light or disappearing again into the shadows that had kept him safe. He settled his weight, preparing to watch through the long, cold night. The silence of the next morning was louder than Clara's scream had been. The arrow was gone. When she crept out at dawn, her heart rattling against her ribs like a trapped bird. The tree trunk was clean. There was only the scar in the bark, a deep, dark wound. She had not slept. She had sat, bolted in, until the first gray light. The world, she now understood, was divided. There was the small, lit space of her cabin, and then there was the darkness, and the darkness was full of watchers. The children arrived at 9, their faces bright from the cold morning air. Clara tried to teach. She pointed to the letters, her voice sounding hollow in her own ears. A is for apple, B is for bear, C is for cabin. She kept looking at the door, at the single glass window, expecting Mac's bearded face to press against it. The children sensed it. They were quiet, their eyes wide, picking up the scent of adult fear like animals. That afternoon, she sent them home an hour early. She locked the schoolhouse and returned to her cabin. She had to do something. Running was not an option. Hallow Ridge was a prison of judgment, but this forest was a wilderness of raw threat. She rummaged through the few belongings the trapper had left behind. In a small, tin-lined box beneath the rope bed, she found it, a Navy revolver, pitted with rust. It was heavy, cold. She broke it open. 4 cartridges sat in the chambers, green with verdigris. She did not know if they would fire. She did not know how to shoot, but she cleaned it with an oiled rag, her hands shaking, and placed it on the table. It was a cold comfort, but it was a comfort nonetheless. She went outside, her eyes scanning the tree line. She felt exposed. She gathered small, sharp stones and piled them by her door. She found an old tin can and a length of twine, setting it up near the path so that anyone approaching in the dark might snag it. They were a child's traps, clumsy and desperate, but they were hers. She was not alone in her efforts. The next morning, she opened her door to a stack of firewood so large it blocked her view. It was not her wood. Her pile was a tangle of small limbs and damp pine. This was seasoned oak and hickory, split clean and sharp, perfectly dry. It was a full week's worth of warmth, stacked with an invisible, practiced hand. She stared at it, her hand on her throat. The arrow man, he was still out there. That night, the wolves came. Their howls began at moonrise, a chorus of high, lonely notes that sharpened into a frantic, snarling pack sound. It was close. They were in the clearing. Clara ran to the window, the useless revolver in her hand. She could see them, 7 or 8 dark shapes, circling, their eyes glittering green in the moonlight. They were testing her cabin. She backed away, her spine cold. She braced for the sound of them throwing themselves against the door. A single shot cracked through the night. It was not the dull boom of a shotgun. It was a high-velocity rifle shot, a sharp, flat crack that echoed off the ridge. It was followed by a yelp, and then the sound of the pack scattering, crashing through the underbrush as they fled. Silence returned. Clara leaned against the wall, her knees weak. He was out there. He was watching. She did not know if he was a savior or simply a different kind of threat. High on the ridge, Elias Thorne lowered his rifle. He did not bother to check his shot. He knew where it had landed. He settled back against the pine, the cold seeping into his buckskins, and continued his watch. He had been watching her for weeks, but now he was guarding her. The smell of her wood smoke, thin and sweet, reached him. It was the smoke from the wood he had left her. It reminded him of other fires, of other lives. The smoke was a trigger, and the memory, always waiting in the dark, took him. It was 1864. The air was thick and wet, not with pine, but with the rot of the Tennessee swamps. He was Captain Elias Thorne, Union scout, and he was leading 6 men into a trap he did not know was set. He was meeting a Confederate deserter. A man named Rooker had sworn was clean. Rooker, his second, ambitious and full of sly smiles. "He's waiting in the old mill, Captain," Rooker had said. "Just like I told you." Elias had trusted him. That was his first mistake. They dismounted, moving through the ruined mill in the pre-dawn gloom. Elias went first. He remembered the click. Not a rifle, something heavier. He remembered shouting, a warning that never finished. The world exploded in fire and splinters. The powder keg Rooker had set took the mill's floor. Elias remembered the noise, a sound so loud it became silence. He remembered the feeling of flying. And then the fire. It had claimed his men instantly. It had only kissed him, a searing, melting kiss that fused his coat to his skin and his skin to the bone. He woke up 3 weeks later in a dark cabin, his face a single, throbbing mask of agony. An old woman, a healer who lived in the swamps, had pulled him from the wreckage. "They're all gone," she whispered, feeding him broth. "Your men, they're saying you did it." He didn't understand. She brought him a newspaper, a month old, Captain Elias Thorne. It said, "Deserter, traitor, led his patrol into a Confederate ambush for gold. His name was blackened, his honor destroyed. Rooker, the sole survivor who had conveniently been securing the horses, had told the tale. Elias had no face left to show the world, and no name he could claim. When he was strong enough to walk, he looked at his reflection in a pool of water. The man who looked back was a monster. The left side of his face a knotted rope of scar tissue. His eye pulled tight. His jaw a permanent snarl. Elias Thorne died in that swamp. A ghost walked west. For 10 years, he had been a rumor, a hermit, a shadow in the high mountains. He had forgotten the sound of his own voice, until this woman, this teacher, back in the clearing. Clara's fear had found new purchase. The gifted firewood and the rifle shot meant she was protected, but they also confirmed she was not paranoid. The threat was real. A few days later, she went to the stream. Her arrow man had left her alone for a time. There had been no new signs. She wondered, with a twist of fear, if he had gone. She dipped her bucket in the frigid water. As she stood, something red caught her eye. Snagged on a low branch near the path, a place she could not possibly miss, was a scrap of cloth. She stepped closer, her blood running cold. It was a piece of a bandana. Dirty, red, and torn. She had seen it before. It was Max. It had not been there yesterday. He had come back. He had been here, this close, walking the path she walked every day. He had left this for her. It was not a forgotten item. It was a promise. Her hands began to shake. The woods, which had been her protector's domain, now felt like a trap. The arrowman could not be everywhere. She ran back to the cabin, the water buckets forgotten. She had to chop wood. She had to stay warm. The cold was her other enemy. She grabbed the axe, the one she had grown used to. But her hands were not steady. Her mind was not on the task. She was thinking of Mac's eyes. She was thinking of the red cloth. She was thinking of the cold, thin bolt on her door. She swung the axe. It was a clumsy, panicked strike. It glanced off the knot in the pine log, deflected by her fear. She tried to pull it back, but the momentum was wrong. The heavy blade skipped and bit deep into the side of her left forearm, just below the elbow. She looked down, numb. There was the axe, buried in the wood pile, and there was the axe, buried in her arm. It was a detached, confusing thought. She pulled her arm free. The axe fell. The blood did not seep. It pumped, a bright, shocking red against the pale skin of her arm. It splashed onto the wood chips, onto the front of her dress. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, no." She grabbed her arm, pressing her other hand against the wound. The blood ran through her fingers. She stumbled toward the cabin, a wave of dizziness washing over her, making the trees tilt. She had to get inside. She had to get the bandage. She made it to the porch, her legs like water. The world was going gray and fuzzy. She fumbled for the door latch, her bloody hand slipping. She could hear a rushing sound in her ears. She slumped against the door frame, her strength gone. The ground, covered in pine needles, rushed up to meet her. Elias from the trees saw her go down. He had seen the wild swing of the axe. He had seen her grab her arm. He had waited, as he always did, for her to get up. She did not get up. A pool of dark red was spreading around her on the porch. He forgot his own rules. He forgot the years of hiding, the face he could not show, the world he had renounced. He only saw her, small and pale, bleeding out on his old doorstep. He broke from the trees, covering the 50 yards in a matter of seconds. He was a large man, but he moved with a silence that was terrifying. He knelt, his heart pounding. "Clara," he said. The name felt strange. She was unconscious. Her face was the color of ash. He ripped his glove off and pressed his bare, calloused hand to the wound. It was deep, arterial. He swore, a low, rough sound. He scooped her into his arms. She weighed nothing, a bundle of damp wool and failing life. He kicked the cabin door open. The bolt she always set was, for once, undone, and carried her inside. He laid her gently on the cot. He did not have time for gentleness. He ran to her water bucket, grabbed her cleanest dish rag, and soaked it. He returned to her side, his hands, which had known only the trigger of a rifle and the handle of a skinning knife for 10 years, were surprisingly steady. He unwrapped the sodden rag she had clutched, revealing the gaping wound. He worked quickly, washing the cut, his touch firm. He ripped a long strip from her spare bedsheet, making a thick pad, and bound her arm, tight, pulling the knot with his teeth. He stood back, breathing hard. The bleeding had slowed, but she was still unconscious. He built up the fire, his movements economical, throwing log after log into the stove until it roared, fighting back the cold that was claiming her. He looked around the cabin. Her small, neat life, the books, the single chair, the rusted revolver on the table. Clara's world swam back into focus slowly, through a fog of pain and cold. Her arm throbbed, a deep, burning ache. She was in her cabin. She was on her cot. She was warm. And she was not alone. She gasped, her eyes flying open. A man was standing by her stove, his back to her. He was huge, filling the small space. He wore clothes made of cured skins and dark wool. As he turned, the firelight caught his face. Clara's breath hitched. She tried to scramble back, but a bolt of pain shot up her arm. The man froze. He was a stranger, but she knew him. His size, his silent presence. The left side of his face was a ruin, a web of puckered, discolored scars that pulled his eye and mouth into a permanent, grim expression. But his right eye, a clear, piercing blue, was full of a hunted, desperate alarm. "Be still," he said. His voice was a shock. It was low, a gravelly rasp, as if he had not spoken in a very long time. "You'll start the bleeding again." Who are you?" she whispered, her hand instinctively going to her throat. "You cut yourself. Bad." He gestured to the bloody rags in the wash basin, then to her neatly bandaged arm. "The arrow," she said. It was not a question. "The firewood. The wolf." He gave a single, curt nod. He looked like a cornered animal, ready to bolt through the wall. He did not belong in a room. He belonged to the trees. The silence in the cabin stretched, thick and heavy. He was waiting for her to scream. She was waiting for him to move. But underneath her terror, a wave of profound gratitude washed over her. He had saved her, twice, 3 times. "I have coffee," she said, her voice trembling. He looked at her, confused. "In the tin, on the shelf," she said, nodding toward it. If you would make it." It was an absurd thing to say to the terrifying, scarred wild man who had just saved her life. But it was all she had. It was an offering, a tether to keep him from vanishing. He looked at the tin, then back at her. For a long moment, he did not move. Then, he nodded. He turned to the stove, his movements surprisingly deft. He filled the pot with water, spooned in the coffee, and set it to heat. They waited in silence. The only sounds the hiss of the stove and the howl of the wind outside. He brought her a mug, handing it to her, his large, rough hand careful not to touch hers. He poured the rest into a tin cup for himself. He did not sit. He stood by the fire, a guardian, his rifle leaning against the wall where he could reach it. "Thank you," Clara said, the hot coffee burning her throat. For all of it." He nodded again, his eyes on the fire. "They came back," she whispered. "Mac. He left a piece of his bandana by the stream." His head snapped up. His good eye narrowed. "When?" "This morning. That's why I cut myself. I was afraid. They'll be back," he said. It was the same thing he'd said to himself. "I know." She looked at his face, at the terrible scars, and then at his eyes. She saw the same pain she carried in her own chest, the pain of loss, of being an outcast. "Why are you out here?" she asked gently. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Just am." She knew that answer. It was the same as her own. She was a widow, a pariah. He was, a man hiding from a world that had clearly tried to burn him alive. She did not ask his name. She did not ask about his face. She knew a soul that wanted to be left alone. He stayed until the coffee was gone. He checked her bandage, his touch rough but not unkind. "Keep it clean," he growled. "Keep it dry." He picked up his rifle, moved to the door, and paused. "Bolt this after me." "Will you come back?" she asked, the words out before she could stop them. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. And then he was gone, melting into the dusk. Clara dragged herself to the door and threw the bolt. He did come back, not in the day. She never saw him. But at night, she knew he was there. She would wake, sensing him, and look out her small window to see a dark shape, unmoving, at the edge of the tree line, a statue of a man, watching her clearing, watching her cabin. A week passed. Her arm began to heal. One night, a fierce storm blew in, a cold rain that turned the world to mud. She left the bolt off the door. She sat by the fire, listening to the rain lash the cabin. The door creaked open. He was there, dripping wet, his hat low over his eyes. He did not come in, but stood in the doorway, shaking the water from his coat, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He was her silent sentinel. She did not speak. She just nodded, and went back to her mending. He stood there for an hour, a dark, protective shadow, guarding her perimeter from the small safety of her porch. Clara began to talk to him, not to him, but at him. She filled the silence. She told him about the little girl, Beth, who had finally learned her letters. She told him about the book she was reading, how the hero was a fool. He never answered. He just grunted. Or sometimes, she thought, she heard him shift his weight in agreement. He was a listener. He was the safest confessor in the world. The rain continued for 2 days. On the second evening, she was caught outside, trying to secure a loose shutter on the schoolhouse. She ran back, soaked to the skin, her thin wool dress clinging to her like a second, cold skin. She burst into the cabin, shivering, and he was already there, inside, standing by the fire he had clearly stoked. It's a terrible night," she said, breathless, pushing wet hair from her face. He just nodded, his eyes on the storm. She stood by the fire, her back to him, trying to warm herself. The wool was steaming, and she was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. She turned around, rubbing her arms, and found him staring. He was not looking at her face. His gaze was fixed on her, on her body. The wet wool of her blouse was nearly transparent, clinging to the lines of her chemise, the curve of her shoulders, the plain, full shape of her breasts. It was not the leering, hungry look of Mac. It was something different, something rawer. It was a look of profound, aching loneliness. A look of a man who had not seen a woman, not been near one, in a lifetime. It was a look of desperate, starved desire. The air in the cabin grew thick and hot, charged with something other than the stove. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She did not move. She did not cover herself. He saw her see him. A deep, dark flush rose from his neck, visible even under the scars. A look of profound self-loathing crossed his features. He jerked his gaze away, as if struck. He turned his back to her, gripping the log mantle of the fireplace, his knuckles turning white. He stared into the flames, a wall of ice and shame suddenly radiating from him. The moment was shattered. He had withdrawn, not just his gaze, but his very presence, retreating back into the broken, scarred hermit, leaving her alone by the fire, still trembling, but no longer just from the cold. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, fractured peace. By day, Clara was the teacher. She found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The children, her small flock of 9, were her anchor. She taught them sums. She read them poetry. And in their bright, unjudging eyes, she was not a widow, not an outcast, but simply teacher. The small plank building was her sovereign territory, a world she controlled, but the nights belonged to Elias. She grew bolder. The door was no longer bolted against him. She left it unlatched, a silent invitation. She would stir the fire, and he would be there, a shadow detaching itself from the porch, stepping into the dim light of the cabin. He never used the door, not at first. He simply materialized, his presence filling the small room. He would bring things, a brace of rabbits, already skinned and cleaned, a small pouch of dried herbs that made a sweet, calming tea. They sat in the quiet. At first, the silence was a language of its own, a shared space of two people who had been alone for so long that words felt like a trespass. But Clara, emboldened by his constant, quiet protection, began to talk. She told him about her day, about the boy Eli who struggled with his letters, about the girl Beth who drew pictures of birds. One night, she looked at him, his scarred face turned toward the flames, and asked, "Why? Why do you stay out here? Why not go to a town?" He was still for so long she thought he would not answer. When he spoke, his voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse. "Towns are for men who have faces. They are for men who have names," he told her, not all at once, but in fragments, night after night. He spoke of the war, not of battles, but of the weight of command. "I had men," he said, his good eye fixed on something far beyond the cabin wall. "Their lives, in my hands, I lost them, all of them." He spoke of the fire, the betrayal, the blame. "The world thinks Elias Thorne is a traitor, burned up in his own disgrace. Let him." He traced one of the deep scars on his jaw. This is what the world gives you. It's better to be a ghost. Ghosts ain't expected to talk. They ain't expected to feel." His confession was a key. It unlocked her own. One night, as the wind moaned around the eaves, she felt the familiar, cold hand of her own grief. She finally gave it a voice. "My husband, Robert," she began, her own voice trembling. "He died in a fire. I was with child." Elias turned his head, his gaze sharp, meeting hers fully for the first time. "It was our home," she whispered, twisting her wedding band, the ring she still wore. "A small house. We were saving for something better. I had gone to my sister's. When I came back, there was just smoke, and the sound of the neighbors shouting. He was inside. He never came out." She took a ragged breath. "They said it was quick. I pray they were right. I lost him, and I lost the baby, a boy. We were going to call him Samuel." She had not said this aloud to anyone. The people in Hollow Ridge saw a widow. They did not see the mother who had lost her child before its first breath. She looked at Elias, at this broken, hidden man, and saw the first flicker of understanding she had seen in almost a year. "Every night," she confessed, the tears finally coming, hot and silent. "Every night, I still smell the smoke. It's a ghost, too. It never leaves me." He did not comfort her. He did not offer platitudes. He simply sat there, a witness, his own immense, scarred presence, a testament to the fact that people could survive being burned. That night, the space between them changed. It was no longer just a protector and his charge. They were two survivors, two ghosts, sharing the same small fire. The next day, the practical side of him returned, fueled by what she had told him. He appeared at her door not at night, but in the broad, cold light of morning. He was not a shadow, but a man. He carried 3 thick, cured planks of wood. "Your door is tinder," he stated. "That bolt is a joke." He worked all day. Clara had sent the children home, telling them school was closed for the afternoon. She watched him, marveling at the skill in his large, rough hands. He tore the flimsy door from its leather hinges. He built a new one, thick and solid, reinforced with wood he had brought. He crafted a new latch and a heavy ironwood bar that slid into brackets. He sank deep into the cabin's log walls. It was a door built to withstand a siege. His silence was one of total concentration. When he was done, he tested the bar. It thudded into place, a sound of absolute, final security. He turned, wiping his hands on his buckskins. His eyes fell on the rusted revolver on her table. "You know how to use this?" "No," she admitted, ashamed. He picked it up. "It's a wonder you ain't shot yourself." He sat at her table, and with a small kit from his pouch, he began to clean it. His movements were deft, practiced, and deeply military. He broke it down, oiled the moving parts, scraped the rust away, and polished the barrel. It looked like a different weapon when he was done. "Come," he said, standing. He led her into the woods, far from the clearing. He produced 6 new, brass-cased cartridges from his pocket. He loaded one. He handed the revolver to her. "Grip first." It was heavier than she remembered. Cold. She held it at arm's length, her whole body rigid with fear. "It ain't a snake," he grumbled. "It won't bite you less you tell it to. Hold it proper." He tried to instruct her from a distance. "Plant your feet. No, wider. Sight down the barrel. Squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it." She tried. She aimed at a broad pine trunk. Her hands trembled so violently she could not keep the sight steady. The fear of Mac, the memory of her own helplessness, the sheer, terrifying noise she knew it would make, it was all too much. "I can't," she whispered, her arm dropping. Elias sighed, a sound of profound exasperation. He stepped behind her. It was the first time they had truly touched. He was a wall of heat at her back. He put his left hand on her shoulder, steadying her. Then, his large, scarred right hand covered hers. It enveloped her hand, his fingers overlapping hers, forcing them into the correct grip. Her trembling hand was lost in his. The world stopped. She could feel the calluses on his palm. She could smell the scent of him, pine, leather, wood smoke, and a faint, clean, metallic smell. He was pressed against her back, his chest solid, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. A jolt, sharp and bright, went through her. A spark in a place she had thought long dead. It was not just his touch. It was his closeness, his protection made physical. "Breathe," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "You're holding your breath. Breathe. Now. Look at the tree. Squeeze." She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The recoil slammed her back against his chest, but he held her firm. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt. "Again," he said, his voice unchanged. He did not move his hand. He cocked the hammer. "Again." He made her fire all 6 shots. His hand stayed on hers, his body a fortress behind her. By the final shot, her hand was steady. She hit the tree. He stepped back. The cold air rushed in to fill the space where he had been. Clara stood, her arm tingling, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nose. She felt lightheaded, but she also felt powerful. "Good," he said. It was the highest praise. "Now, you reload." They didn't speak of the touch. They didn't speak of the moment his body had shielded hers, but it lay between them, as real and solid as the new door. 3 days later, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. A wind came down from the north, sharp and carrying the taste of ice. Elias arrived early, his arms loaded with wood, his face grim. "It's a bad one," he said, dumping the wood by the stove. "It'll be here by nightfall, and it will stay." He was right. The snow began not as flakes, but as a sideways torrent, a whiteout that erased the world. The wind screamed, a living thing, clawing at the cabin. By dusk, the clearing was gone. The schoolhouse was a white mound, and the world had shrunk to the 4 log walls of Clara's cabin. Elias, who had intended to leave, was trapped. He stood by the door, his rifle in hand, staring out the window at the white chaos. "You can't go," Clara said, her voice quiet. "You'll die out there." He knew it. He gave a sharp, frustrated nod and unslung his rifle. He set it by the door. He was a wild animal, caged, and the small cabin felt suddenly tiny. The first night was a trial of awkwardness. They shared her meager supplies, salt pork and beans. They sat at her small table. It was the first meal he had shared with another human being in 10 years. He ate, as he did everything, with a grim efficiency. But the storm was a relentless, howling monster. It made conversation necessary, a bulwark against the noise and the fear. To fill the silence, they talked. And for the first time, the talk was not of ghosts. She asked him about the West, about the mountains. He told her about tracking elk, about the way the stars looked from 10,000 feet. He told her about his childhood in Vermont, before the war, before the fire. He had been a farmer's son. She told him about Ohio, about her father, who had been a preacher. She told him about her love of books. And then, impossibly, they laughed. He had told a dry story about a grizzly bear that had stolen his entire pack, and he had been forced to walk 50 miles in his underclothes. The sound of his laugh was a shock, a low, rusty rumble that shook his whole frame. Seeing him laugh, Clara laughed too, a real, bright sound that surprised them both. The cabin, for an hour, was not a prison, but a shelter. They slept in shifts. She took the cot. He refused it, sitting in the single chair, his back to the wall, his rifle across his knees. They were two soldiers, holding a tiny fort against the wilderness. The second night, the storm did not abate. The wind howled. They had run out of stories. The cabin was warm, but the tension, which had been buried under talk, had returned. It was the tension from the shooting lesson, the awareness of his body, her body, in this small, shared space. They had been silent for an hour. Clara got up to stoke the fire, which was burning low. She knelt on the hearth, the firelight washing her face in gold and red, illuminating the soft strands of hair that had escaped her bun. Elias watched her. He was fighting a war inside himself. This woman, she was everything he was not. She was clean. She was good. She was soft. He was a ruin, a killer, a monster who hid his face. But he had watched her for months. He had seen her strength, her kindness, her grief, and he ached. His 10 years of lonely resolve, his vow to remain a ghost, was breaking. As she reached for the iron poker, he moved. He knelt beside her on the hearth. He reached out and put his scarred, calloused hand over hers. She froze. The poker was hot against her skin, but she didn't feel it. She only felt the weight of his hand, the rough texture, the impossible warmth. She did not pull away. She turned her hand over, slowly, until her palm was against his. He looked at her, his good eye full of a desperate, pleading question. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He leaned in. The kiss was not like she remembered. It was not the chaste, polite kiss of her husband. This was slow, uncertain. It was a question. His lips were chapped, but soft. The kiss tasted of coffee and smoke and a decade of loneliness. He was clumsy, as if he had forgotten how. She was just as lost. She put her free hand on his shoulder, and she felt the muscles there, hard as rock, trembling. He deepened the kiss, and it became something else. It was not just a kiss. It was a confession. It was all the words they could not say. It was a raw, desperate need, a hunger for contact, for life, for something other than grief. Then, as quickly as it started, he broke it. He pulled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked horrified, as if he had just committed a terrible crime. He stood up, backing away from her, his hand raised as if to ward her off. I'm sorry, he rasped, his voice thick. Clara, I shouldn't have. He looked at his scarred hand, then at his ruined face, visible in the firelight. He was overwhelmed by the feeling, by the shame, by his own transgression. He was the monster. He had touched her. Clara was still on her knees, her lips tingling, her heart pounding. She was not horrified. She was not afraid. She was, for the first time in a year, alive. She stood slowly. He flinched, expecting her to run, to scream. Elias, she whispered. She took a step toward him. He held his ground, but he looked like he wanted to bolt. She touched her own lips. I wanted it. The admission hung in the air, more powerful than the storm. His face crumpled, just for a second. The desire was now a shared thing, a live thing in the room. It was raw, mutual, and heavy as a shroud. But they both knew the line. He was a wanted man, a ghost. She was a teacher, a widow. They held back, two people on the edge of a cliff, terrified of the fall. The storm cleared on the third morning. The world was a blinding, silent white. The silence in the cabin was just as heavy. charged with the unspoken, the unfinished. Elias, grim and silent, gathered his things, his face set in a mask of remorse. A frantic, muffled pounding came from the new door. Clara started, her hand flying to her throat. Elias had his rifle in his hand before the second knock. Clara unbarred the door. It was Eli, the oldest of her students. His face was blue with cold, his coat caked in snow. He was crying, great, choking sobs. "Teacher," he gasped, falling into her arms. "Teacher, they came." "Who? Eli, who came?" Clara held him, her heart seizing. "Mr. Mac," the boy cried, his voice muffled in her skirt. "He and his men, the storm. They were drunk. They came to our homestead. They hit Pa. They hit him bad. They took all our flour, and—" He sobbed, unable to continue. "And what, Eli? What did they do? They burned the barn." He wept. "They burned it. With the new calf inside. They said it was a warning. For Pa. For sending us to school. For you." Clara held the boy, a cold, hard fury replacing her fear. She looked over the boy's head, her eyes meeting Elias's. He stood by the door, his face a terrible mask of cold. Controlled rage. The man who had been overwhelmed by a kiss was gone. In his place was the soldier, the scout. He knew exactly what this meant. He waited until the boy was calm, until Clara had given him a hot drink and wrapped him in a blanket. He gave the boy curt instructions on how to get home, what trail was safest. When the boy was gone, Elias turned to Clara. The air in the cabin was freezing. "That message wasn't for the boy's PA," he said, his voice flat and deadly. "It was for you. They were showing you what they can do." He looked out at the pristine white snow. His eyes narrowed. "They'll come again, and next time they won't stop at a barn. Next time they'll come for you." The kiss, the laughter, the shared warmth of the storm. It was all gone. It had evaporated like breath in the wind, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the boy's tears and the smell of distant, spiteful smoke. The soldier had replaced the man, Elias, who had looked at her with such raw, overwhelmed longing, now looked at the world with a flat, cold distance. He was no longer a guest in her cabin. He was its commander. "You're not safe," he said, not looking at her. His voice the one he used to the storm. "Not in the school, not here." He left the cabin and disappeared for hours. When he returned, he was not the mountain man who brought her rabbits. He was pulling a heavy tar-wrapped bundle on a makeshift sled. He brought it inside, the snow melting in puddles on her floor. He unrolled the tarpaulin. Clara stared. Inside were 3 rifles. Not hunting rifles, but heavy, military-grade weapons. A Sharp's carbine, its barrel long and deadly. A Spencer repeating rifle, and his own, the one he always carried. Alongside them were boxes of ammunition, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, and a coil of thin, dark wire. In a separate leather roll, he had a collection of long, wicked-looking skinning knives, and 3 steel bear traps, their teeth smelling of rust and old iron. He had been preparing for this. For 10 years. He had been waiting for the world to find him. "You have to go," he said, his back to her as he began to clean and oil the Spencer, its mechanisms clicking with lethal precision. "Go to Hollow Ridge. Tell them what happened. They have a sheriff. They have to protect you." "The sheriff?" Clara gave a short, bitter laugh. "The sheriff is one of the men who looks at me like Mac does. The women in that town already think I'm indecent. If I go back, they will say I brought this on myself. They will not help me." "Then you go south," he argued, his voice rough, impatient. "Go to Cheyenne. Get on a train and do not look back. I will give you the money. I have a cache." Clara walked to the small window, looking at the white, empty clearing. She had spent a year running. She had run from the fire, from the whispers of pity, from the ghost of her husband and the empty arms that ached for her child. She had run until she hit this place, the very edge of the world, and here, in this cold, isolated cabin, she had found something, a strength she didn't know. A man who saw her, not as a broken widow, but as a person. No, she said. He stopped his work. The click of the rifle bolt was the only sound. No, I am done running. Elias. She turned to face him, her hands clasped, her chin high. They took my home in Ohio. They won't take this one. Society. It has never given me anything but rules for how to be quiet and small. The men in that town, they judge me. The women, they scorn me. And those outlaws, they think I'm a toy to be broken. She took a breath, a fire lighting in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. This place, this is the only place I've ever been that is mine, and you're the only person who has ever made me feel seen. I am not running from society. I am not running from grief, and I am not running from fear. Not anymore. He stood, the rifle in his hand. He was a giant of a man. His scarred face a mask of disbelief and a raw, terrifying anger. You don't understand. Clara, this ain't a matter of talk. This ain't a town meeting. Mac and his men are not just bullies. They're animals. When they come, it will be blood. You think you're strong because you hit a tree with a revolver? You're a teacher. You read books. You have no idea what's coming. Then teach me, she said, her voice shaking but unbroken. Teach me to fight. You taught me to shoot. You built me a door. Don't tell me to run. Stand with me, but I am not leaving. He stared at her for a long time. The anger in his eyes was at war with something else. Admiration, and a profound, aching despair. He had wanted her to be safe. He saw that she was, in her own quiet, stubborn way, as much of a fighter as he was, and he knew she was right. They wouldn't just let her leave. He slammed the rifle down on the table. All right, he said, his voice a low growl. All right, but you do what I say. When I say it, you're not a teacher anymore. Clara, you're a soldier, and school starts now. The next few days were the hardest of her life. He was a brutal, relentless teacher. He hauled her from her bed before dawn. He took her into the snow-choked woods, forcing her to walk the perimeter, to see the trails he saw. Where would they come from? He'd demand, grabbing her shoulder. The main track, she'd answer. Wrong, he snapped. They'll come from the ridge, high ground, always. Now, look, see that break in the trees? That's a game trail. But it's too wide. Men have been using it. He taught her to use the Spencer. He made her load and reload until her fingers were numb and bleeding. He taught her how to set a wire trap, how to loop the thin wire low to the ground to catch a running man's ankle. He gave her one of the long skinning knives. It's not for whittling, he said, his hand over hers, showing her the angle. You don't stab, you cut up or across, and you mean it. You hesitate. You die. He pushed her, past her fear, past her exhaustion, past the soft-handed woman she had been. And in that shared, desperate work, the tension from the storm, the unfinished kiss, grew. It was there when he stood behind her, correcting her aim, his body a familiar wall of heat. It was there when they sat at the table at night, cleaning weapons, their knees inches apart. The air between them was thick with gunpowder and oil, and a desire so profound it was a physical ache. They were two souls pared down to their essential selves. The world was trying to kill them, and it was forcing them to live, more intensely than either had in a decade. It was the fourth night. The training had been brutal. Clara's arms ached, her hands were cut, and a deep bruise was forming on her shoulder from the rifle's kick. She was exhausted, but she was also, for the first time, not afraid. She was angry. They sat by the fire, the cabin silent. Elias was sharpening his knife. The shing-shing-shing of the steel on the stone a hypnotic, lonely sound. You're a good teacher, Clara said, her voice quiet. A hard one. He stopped, his head down. I'm turning you into me, Clara. Into a killer. It ain't something to be proud of. You're teaching me to live, she said. She stood and walked to him. He tensed, his hand gripping the knife. He still expected her to fear him, to see the monster. She knelt in front of him, as she had by the fire on the night of the storm. She looked at his hands, strong and scarred, weapons themselves. Then she looked at his face. She did not look at the scars. She looked into his one good eye, an eye she now knew held not just pain, but loyalty and a deep, buried gentleness. She reached out and put her hand on his. His skin was rough, his hand twice the size of hers. He flinched, but did not pull away. "You are not a killer, Elias," she whispered. "You are a protector. You are the only man who has ever protected me." His breath hitched. He looked at her, and the carefully constructed wall of the soldier crumbled. The man was back, the lonely, overwhelmed man from the storm. "Clara," he breathed, his voice broken. Don't say that. You don't know what I am. You deserve better." "There is no better," she said. "There is only this, you and me, in this cabin, and we are alive, together." She leaned in, slowly, giving him every chance to pull away. He did not. She kissed him. This time, there was no hesitation. There was no uncertainty. It was not a question. It was an answer. He dropped the knife. His hands came up, one burying itself in her hair, pulling the pins free so it tumbled around her shoulders. His other hand went to her waist, pulling her from her knees, lifting her as if she weighed nothing, his mouth never leaving hers. He kissed her like he was starving. He kissed her like he was drowning and she was air. It was a kiss of desperation, of 10 years of solitude, of 1,000 nights of cold and silence. And she met him. She gave him back all her own grief, her own loneliness, her own fear. He carried her to the cot. It was small, a narrow space. He laid her down, his huge frame shielding her from the world. He looked at her, his face a mask of raw need, his eyes shining in the firelight. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "A plea." "You're the only one who ever has," she whispered back, and she pulled him down. In the safety of the cabin, beneath the fur blankets, their intimacy was a revelation. It was not a rushed, frantic thing. It was slow, aching. It was a discovery. It was two people, broken by fire and grief, learning how to touch again. He was so large, she so small, but he was gentle. His hands, which she had seen clean rifles and set traps, were impossibly tender. He touched her face, tracing her features, as if memorizing her, as if seeing a woman for the first time. He was overwhelmed by how much he needed her. He had thought himself dead, a ghost, but his body was alive, and it ached for her. He held himself back, afraid his own scarred, rough self would break her. But Clara was not afraid. She met his touch. She touched him. She ran her hands over his shoulders, his back, and then, with a courage that stunned him, she touched his face. She traced the scars, not with pity, but with a simple, accepting tenderness. He flinched, a sound of deep pain in his throat, but she held him. "You're beautiful," she whispered, and when they finally came together, it was a quiet explosion, a collision of two lonely worlds. It was a release, not of lust, but of grief. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the blankets, the fire burning low, Clara cried. She wept silently, her shoulders shaking. Elias panicked, pulled back. Did I hurt you, Clara?" She shook her head, turning to press her face into his chest. His skin smelled of pine and smoke. "No," she sobbed, her voice muffled. "No, it's the first time I've felt alive. In years, I thought that part of me was dead. I thought it burned up with Robert." He held her, his arms wrapping around her, his own heart breaking. He had not known what he was doing. He had only known his own need. He had not realized he was healing her. He held her as she wept for her lost husband, for her lost child, for the woman she had been. And in holding her, he felt a piece of his own frozen soul begin to thaw. Their bodies and souls clung to each other, hungry and healing. Two halves of a broken thing made whole in the dark. The morning came, cold and gray. The light felt like an intrusion. They woke slowly, still wrapped around each other, the reality of their situation returning. Elias was the first to move. He looked at her, sleeping in his arms, her face soft in the dawn light. The shame came crashing back. What had he done? He had taken her. He had brought his own darkness into her, the only good, clean thing he had seen in a decade. He slipped from the bed, his movements silent. He stood by the fire, pulling on his trousers. Clara woke, her body aching in a new, sweet way. She saw him, his broad back, his head bowed. Elias. He turned. His face was a mask of self-loathing. "I shouldn't have," he said, his voice flat. "It was a mistake." Clara sat up, pulling the blanket around her. "It was not a mistake. I don't deserve you," he said, his voice raw. "Look at me, Clara. I'm a dead man. I have a bounty on my head. I have nothing to offer you but blood and trouble. I'm a monster." She stood, walking to him, not bothering to cover herself. She was not ashamed. Not in front of him. She stood before him, bare and unafraid. "You are not a monster," she said, putting her hand on his chest, over his pounding heart. "You're the only man who ever saw me, really saw me. Robert, he loved me, but he saw a wife. The town, they see a widow, or a whore. You saw a person. You saw me." He looked at her, his throat thick. He had no words for what he felt. He pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in. "I will not let them touch you," he swore. "I will kill them all before they lay a hand on you." It was a promise, and it was a curse. The outlaws returned that night. They had been so lost in each other, in their training, that they had let their guard down. They were in the cabin, cleaning up after a small meal. A sudden, bright orange light filled the window. Elias was moving before Clara even registered the color. He grabbed her, throwing her to the floor, covering her body with his. "Stay down!" A sound, a great whoosh, and the smell of kerosene. Then, gunfire. Not at them, but into the air. Wild, drunken, whooping. They crawled to the window. Elias peered over the sill. Mac and his men were in the clearing, but they were not attacking the cabin. They were at the schoolhouse. They had thrown torches onto its roof. The new dry pine, the symbol of her new life, was erupting in flames. The fire was roaring, devouring the small building. "Next time, teacher!" Mac's voice, a drunken yell, carried over the crackle of the flames. "Next time, we come for you and your wild man!" They fired their guns into the air once more, laughed, and then they were gone, riding away. Their mission of terror complete. Clara stared, her mouth open, as the roof of her schoolhouse caved in. The place she had taught, the place she had been teacher, it was gone. It was a funeral pyre. Elias said nothing. He watched the flames, his face not just scarred, but carved from stone. The man who had been afraid of his own desire was gone. The man who had feared his own past was gone. All that was left was the scout, the killer. Clara turned to him. "Elias!" He snapped. He grabbed his rifle, his pack, and his knives. He was checking his ammunition, his movements fast and economical. "Elias, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice high with panic. "Bolter the door," he said, not looking at her. "The new one. Bar it, and keep the Spencer by the window. Shoot anything that isn't me." "Where are you going?" she cried, grabbing his arm. He stopped, his hand on her. His touch was cold. "They made a mistake," he said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "They showed me where they are. I'm going to finish this." "No, Elias, don't leave me." "I'm not leaving you," he said. "I'm protecting you. They burned your school. They left a message. Now I'm going to leave one of mine." He opened the door, a blast of cold air and smoke filling the cabin. "Bar it." And he was gone. He did not run. He melted into the trees, a ghost moving through the darkness. His rifle in his hand, he hunted them. He moved through the forest trails, his rage a cold, blue flame. He was faster, quieter, and smarter. He was what the army had made him. He was what the wilderness had perfected. He found their trail in less than an hour, the tracks of 4 horses, sloppy and confident. He found their camp. It was a crude lean-to, miles away, a smoldering fire at its center. They were drinking, celebrating. Mac and his 2 men, Elias, did not attack the camp. That was not his way. He was a scout. He set an ambush. He found one of his own wire traps, left from a hunting expedition, and set it on the trail back to their camp. Then he waited. One of the men, the nervous one Clara had seen by the stream, got up to relieve himself. He walked into the woods, away from the firelight. Elias was on him in silence. He did not use his rifle. A hand over the mouth, the long, sharp knife. It was a single, clean, professional movement. The first violent act he had committed against a man in 10 years. It was quick, and it was horrifyingly easy. He left the body where it fell. He retreated, circling back to the trail. He waited. He was a patient man. An hour later, another of the men, the mean-looking, silent one, went to check on his friend. He walked down the dark trail, calling his name. He hit the wire. It snagged his ankle, throwing him forward. He cried out, surprised, and landed hard. Elias was already moving. He stepped from the trees, a large, dark shadow. The man scrambled, trying to draw his pistol. Elias fired the sharps. The sound was a thunderclap, echoing through the valley. The man was thrown back, dead before he hit the snow. Elias stood over him, the smoke from his rifle curling in the frigid air. He felt nothing, just a cold, terrible efficiency. Then the shaking started. He stumbled back to the cabin, the sun a gray rumor in the east. He came not as a soldier, but as a man. He tapped on the door. His signal. Clara threw the bar back, her face pale, her eyes wide. She had been awake all night, clutching the Spencer. He stumbled in, his rifle dragging. He looked at her, his good eye haunted. He leaned against the wall and slid to the floor, his head in his hands. "Elias," she whispered, her heart breaking. "You're hurt." "No," he rasped. Not on the outside." She knelt in front of him, touching his shoulder. He was trembling, a deep, racking tremor. He looked up, his face a ruin of fear and self-loathing. "I killed them," he whispered. "I killed them, Clara, the way I was taught. It was easy." He grabbed her, his hands desperate, his voice breaking. "It's still in me, the killer. After all these years, I'm afraid. Clara, I'm so afraid. I'm afraid of becoming him again." Clara did not flinch. She did not back away from the blood on his hands or the horror in his eyes. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling his large head to her chest. She held him, his body shaking against hers. She was no longer just the teacher. She was no longer just the lover. She was his anchor. "You're not him," she whispered, her own tears falling into his hair. "He was alone. I'm here. I'm right here. You're not alone." The dawn after the killings was cold and gray, the sky a lid of dirty snow. Clara held Elias as he shook, his confession a raw, broken thing in the quiet of the cabin. The man who had faced down a grizzly, who had lived 10 years as a ghost, was terrified of the man he had been. She held him until the shaking stopped, until the silence of the forest returned, heavy and absolute. But the silence was a lie. The burned-out shell of her schoolhouse, a black, skeletal ruin in the snow, was a testament to that. Mac was still out there, and he knew Elias had a face. "You have to go to town," Elias said that afternoon. His voice was flat. The emotion burned out of him. He was back to being the soldier. "He will come back. He lost 2 men. He will come with everything he has. You have to tell the sheriff. You have to make it official. They won't listen to me." "Elias," Clara said, her voice weary. "They have to," he insisted. "You're a teacher. You're a citizen. They burned a school. That's not just an attack on you. It's an attack on the county, on the law." Clara knew he was wrong, but she saw the desperate hope in his eyes. He wanted, for one moment, to believe that the world he had abandoned would still function. That the law he had once served still meant something for him. She would try. She made the 5-mile walk to Hollow Ridge alone. Elias had wanted to watch from the trees, but she forbade it. "If they see you," she said, "you prove their rumors before I can even speak." She dressed in her only other dress, a dark gray wool, and brushed her hair until it was smooth, tying it in a severe knot. She needed to look like a schoolteacher, not a wild woman from the woods. The town was just as she remembered: mud, manure, and the smell of wet pine. But this time, the stares were different. They were no longer just curious. They were sharp, pointed. She walked into the sheriff's office, a small, rank room that smelled of stale tobacco and unwashed men. Sheriff Brody was a large man, his belly spilling over a gun belt he wore low on his hips. He was sitting with his boots on his desk, reading a day-old newspaper. He looked up when she entered, his eyes doing a slow, insulting inventory of her, from her worn boots to her pale, set face. Well, if it ain't the forest teacher." "Sheriff," Clara said, forcing her voice to be steady, "I am here to report a crime, a series of crimes." "Oh?" He didn't move his feet. "Go on." "My schoolhouse was burned to the ground 2 nights ago by a man named Mac and his gang. They've been harassing me for weeks. They attacked a settler family, the Millers, burning their barn. They are threatening to kill me." Sheriff Brody spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into a cuspidor. The sound was loud in the small room. "Mac, you say?" He chuckled, a low, wet sound. "Mac's just a drunk, ma'am. He ain't got the sand to burn a school." "He did," Clara insisted, her hands clenching. "I saw him. He and his men, they left a message. They said they were coming for me next." "Now why would they do that?" Brody leaned forward, his chair creaking. He laced his thick fingers over his belly. "Mac's a reasonable fella, in his way. Likes his drink, likes his women. He don't just go burning schools for no reason. Les, of course. He was provoked." "Provoked?" Clara was stunned. How could I have provoked him?" "Town's a small place. Mrs. Hayes," the sheriff said, his voice greasy with insinuation. "Word gets around. A lone woman, living way out there. No protector. It's indecent. But then, we hear you ain't alone." "Not really." Clara's blood ran cold. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do." He stood, finally, and walked to the window, hitching his trousers. "We hear you took up with some wild thing." "Some savage from the woods. Folks are saying you're living out there in sin, sleeping with some scarred-up hermit. Now, I don't know what kind of arrangement you got, but a woman who lies down with animals? She can't come crying to me when the other animals come sniffing around." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She was dizzy with rage and humiliation. "I came here to report an arson, an attempt on my life. Are you going to do your job?" "My job," Brody said, turning, his face hard, "is to keep the peace. And a woman like you, you're a disturbance. You go out there, you stir up trouble, you live how you want. You can't come to us for help. You made your bed, Mrs. Hayes. Now you go lie in it." He smiled. "Or on it, with whoever you want." Clara walked out of his office, her body trembling so hard she could barely feel her feet. The shame was a physical, scalding thing. It was not over. The whispers followed her down the boardwalk. She had to go to Miller's Mercantile for supplies. For her teaching assignment, Mr. Croft, the school board man, was there. The women she had seen on her first day, Mrs. Miller among them, were gathered by the fabric bolts. When Clara entered, they fell silent. It was a loud, vicious silence. They looked at her, their faces masks of pious, gleeful judgment. "Indecent," one of them whispered, loud enough for Clara to hear. "Sleeping with a savage," said another. "Her poor dead husband, barely cold." The men were worse. The prospectors, the saloon loafers, their leers were no longer cautious. They were bold, open, and filthy. They saw her as the sheriff did. Spoiled goods, a whore, a thing to be used. She found Mr. Croft by the post office counter. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice sounding thin. "I must speak with you. The school. It's been burned." Mr. Croft, a small, weak man, could not meet her eyes. He shuffled his papers, his face a blotchy red. "Yes, Mrs. Hayes. I heard terrible. They burned it," she said. "The Outlaws. I need the county to rebuild. I need protection." "Clara," he said, and the use of her first name was a slap. "Mrs. Hayes, the thing is, the board, they've been hearing things." "Things?" "Rumors, Mrs. Hayes, about your conduct." He cleared his throat. A small, nervous sound. "Your association with a man, a disreputable man, a wild man. He saved my life," Clara said, her voice low and furious. "Be that as it may," Croft said, finally looking up, his eyes watery with self-righteousness. "We cannot have a teacher, a woman, of questionable moral character. The parents will not stand for it. The town will not stand for it. The school board, as of this morning, has voted. Your teaching position is revoked." He slid a small envelope across the counter. "That is your final pay. 2 weeks. I am sorry, but you brought this on yourself." She did not take the money. She looked at his weak, cowardly face. She looked at the women who were now pretending to examine Calico, their shoulders shaking with silent laughter. She looked at the men by the door, who were watching her, their mouths open. She had lost everything. Again, she turned, without a word, and walked out of the mercantile. She walked down the center of the muddy street. Her head high, not looking left or right, she did not run. She walked, each step a hammer blow, out of the town of Hallow Ridge and back into the woods. She returned to the cabin as the sun was setting, a bruised, purple smear in the sky. She was broken. She was empty. She was humiliated. Elias was there. He had been tracking her from a distance, just as she'd asked. He had seen her walk into the sheriff's office, and he had seen her walk out. He had seen the way the townspeople looked at her. He knew, before she said a word. She stumbled into the cabin and fell into the single chair, the tears she had refused to shed in town finally coming. They were not tears of sadness. They were hot, bitter tears of rage. He stood by the door, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. He had done this to her, his presence, his love. He had ruined her. "They revoked my position," she said, her voice dead. They called me. They said I was sleeping with a wild savage." Elias slammed his fist against the log wall. The entire cabin shook. Damn them all to hell." He knelt in front of her, his scarred face a mask of agony. "Clara, we have to go. This is my fault. I brought this on you. I have a cache. Gold. From before. We can go north. To Canada. We can be new. We can find a valley. Build a cabin. No one will know us. No one will find us. We can be free." It was his dream. A valley. A cabin. Her. Clara looked at him, at this man who had run for 10 years, who saw escape as the only answer. She wiped her face, her hands still shaking. "No," she said. He stared at her. "Clara, you heard them. They won't help. They've cast you out. There is nothing left for you here. You are here," she said. She stood, and he rose with her. "This place, this cabin, this clearing, this is mine. It is ours. That town, that is not the world. That is a small, mean, ugly place. But this is our home." She touched his face, her fingers tracing the scars. "You've been running for 10 years. Elias, I've been running for 1. I am done. They took my husband. They took my child. They took my good name. They took my job. They burned my school." Her voice dropped, and it was no longer the voice of a teacher. It was the voice of a woman who had been pushed past her limit. It was a voice as cold and hard as the steel of his traps. "They will not take this," she said. "This is where we make our stand. They think I'm a savage. Then I will be a savage. They want to come for us. Let them come." Elias looked at her, and the ghost in his eyes died. The man who had been afraid of the killer inside him, he was gone, too. She had not only accepted his darkness, she had claimed it as her own. She was not asking him to run. She was asking him to fight. "All right," he said, his voice a low growl. "All right, we stand, but we do it my way." The outlaws circled. Mac was not stupid. He had lost 2 men. He was wary. He sent his remaining men, the 2 who had not been with him that first night, to scout. Elias saw them, 2 riders, keeping to the ridge, watching the cabin with a spyglass. They were testing the defenses. "They're getting bolder," Elias said. His eye pressed to a gap in the cabin wall. "They know the town won't help you. They know you're alone. They think it's just you and 1 man." "They're right," Clara said. "Loading the Spencer." Elias began to work. He was no longer just a protector. He was an engineer of death. He spent a full day in the woods, setting a deadly path, a maze designed to funnel an attacker. He used the wire, but this time, he attached it to the triggers of 2 old shotguns he had in his cache, their barrels packed with rock salt, nails, and black powder. Aimed low, he set 2 of the bear traps, covered with snow and pine needles, on the most obvious paths to the cabin, but the cabin itself, that was the real trap. "They think we're hiding in here," he explained, his voice a low, clinical lecture. "They think we're scared. They'll come at dusk. They'll try to burn us out, or they'll kick the door in, expecting us to be crying in the corner." "And we won't be," Clara said. "No," Elias said. "We won't." Clara insisted on helping. She was not the trembling woman he had taught to shoot. She was a soldier. "I'm small," she said. "I'm quiet. They're watching the cabin. They're not watching the trees." He was terrified, but he saw the steel in her. He took her to the high branches of the massive pine where he had first watched her, the one that gave a clear view of the whole clearing. He showed her how to brace the rifle, how to make a seat from a rope. She spent the day scouting, her body aching, her hands raw, but her eyes sharp. She was his eyes. His second. She proved her bravery, not with words, but with a cold, silent resolve. The final assault came at dusk. The world was purple and gray. A light snow had begun to fall, soft and silent, muffling the world. It was the perfect light for an attack. "They're coming," Clara whispered. She had climbed down from the tree, her face pale but her hands steady. 3 of them, on foot, from the north ridge. They've left their horses. Mac and his last 2, Elias said. He nodded. "It's time." They did not light a lamp. They barred the new, heavy door. Elias took his position, not by the window, but in the darkest corner of the cabin, by the hearth, his heavy axe in his hand, his long knife in his belt. Clara took her spot. She was not in a corner. She was in the open, but hidden in the shadows of the loft, lying flat on the boards. The Spencer repeating rifle pushed through a gap, aimed directly at the door. They waited. The silence was absolute. There was only the sound of the falling snow and the pounding of Clara's heart. It started with a yell. "Teacher, we're here. Come out and play." It was Mac's voice, thick with whiskey and false confidence. A heavy thud as something hit the door. An axe. "Come on, you savage," a different voice yelled. "Show us your face." Another thud. And another. The new door was holding. "To hell with this," Mac roared. They heard a grunt, and then the sound of a heavy log being used as a ram. Crash. The door held. Crash. The bar cracked. Crash. The door burst open, splintered wood flying, the heavy bar shattering. 2 men burst in, shadows against the dying light. They were framed in the doorway, expecting to see 2 terrified figures. "Now," Elias whispered. Clara pulled the trigger. The Spencer's report was deafening in the small cabin. The man on the right, the one who had yelled, was thrown backward out of the door, his chest a ruin. He never made a sound. The second man, stunned, dove to the side, rolling, raising his pistol. Elias moved. He was not a man. He was a shadow, a blur of motion. He crossed the cabin in 2 strides. The man tried to fire, but Elias brought the axe down. Not the blade, the flat. He hit the man's arm, and the sound of bone breaking was a sharp, wet crack. The man screamed. Elias hit him again. It was brutal, close. Clara, from the loft, saw a 3rd figure, Mac. He had been hanging back. He saw his first man blown apart, his second man being butchered. He was no fool. He was a bully, and his courage was gone. He turned to flee. "He's running!" Clara screamed. Elias was still struggling with the second man, who, even with a broken arm, was fighting for his life. Clawing, kicking. A shot exploded, deafeningly close. The man had a second pistol. Elias grunted, a deep, pained sound. He fell back, clutching his side. Clara saw it. She saw Elias go down. She saw Mac, a shadow, disappearing into the snow. A rage, cold and pure, unlike anything she'd ever known. Took her. She scrambled from the loft, grabbing the sharps from the wall. She ran onto the porch, barefoot in the snow, her nightgown, her only armor. "Mac!" she screamed. He was at the tree line, almost safe. He stopped, turned, surprised by her voice, his pistol coming up. Clara raised the heavy rifle. She did not aim. She did not think. She just remembered what Elias had taught her. Breathe. Squeeze. She fired. The recoil threw her back against the doorframe. Max screamed, a high, thin sound. He didn't fall, but he stumbled, grabbing his leg. She had hit him, in the thigh, inside. She heard a sound, a wet, final sound. The fight was over. Elias limped onto the porch. He was clutching his side, and blood was pouring through his fingers, a dark, pulsing stain. His face was white with agony, but his eyes were on Mac, who was trying to crawl into the trees. "Elias, no," Clara whispered. "You're hurt. It's not finished," he rasped. He looked at the axe, still in the cabin, then at the wood pile. He limped to the chopping block and picked up the splitting axe. He began to walk, one slow, limping step at a time, across the clearing. He was a terrifying sight, a great, wounded, bleeding bear. The axe in his hand, his scarred face a mask of terrible, final purpose. Max saw him coming. He tried to reload, his hands shaking. "No, no, please. I'm done. I'll leave." Elias did not stop. He did not speak. He just kept walking, limping through the falling snow, his shadow stretching long in the dusk. He raised the axe. Clara turned away, her stomach heaving. She did not need to see. She heard the sound, a heavy, wet thunk, and then silence. Just silence. The snow fell, soft and thick, covering the bodies, covering the blood, covering the tracks. It fell silently on the burning embers of the schoolhouse and on the 2 dead men in the clearing. Elias stood for a long moment, the axe in his hand. Then he swayed. "Clara," he whispered. He fell to his knees. Clara ran. She flew across the snow, her feet numb. She reached him as he toppled over. "Elias! Elias!" He was bleeding, badly. The shot had gone clean through his side, just above the hip. He was heavy, a dead weight. "Gotta get inside," he mumbled, his eyes fluttering. She grabbed him under the arms. He was all man, all weight. "Help me," she begged, sobbing. "Help me, Elias." She put her shoulder under his arm, his blood soaking her nightgown, and she began to drag him, one step at a time, through the snow, past the body of the man she had shot, past the body of the man he had broken. She dragged him, her savior, her love, her protector, back into the cabin, back to the fire, as the snow fell silently, trying to wash the world clean. The snow fell for 2 days. It was a soft, relentless blanket, a baptism of white, covering the clearing, the bodies, the blood, and the black. Skeletal ruin of the schoolhouse, inside the cabin. There was no sound but the hiss of the fire and the low, pained breathing of Elias. Clara did not sleep. She had dragged him to the cot, her body fueled by a desperate, terrifying strength. The bullet had gone through his side, a clean hole, but it had taken a river of blood with it. She remembered the fire, the smell of burning flesh, and the lessons her father, the preacher, had taught her about cauterizing wounds. She had heated the flat of his skinning knife in the stove until it glowed a dull, menacing red. Elias was delirious, his skin cold, his eyes unfocused. He had looked at her, his good eyes struggling to find her. "Clara," he'd mumbled. "Hold still, my love," she had whispered, her own tears hissing on the hot iron. "Hold still." The smell of his own burning flesh had brought him back to consciousness, a single, sharp scream torn from his throat, and then he had collapsed back into the darkness. She had packed the wounds, front and back, with the last of her clean flour and bound him with strips of her own torn petticoat. For 3 days, he was in the fire. He was not in the cabin. He was back in Tennessee, in the swamp, shouting for his men. He cried out names she did not know: Rooker, Samuel, Lieutenant. He fought phantoms in the small cot, his large body thrashing. Clara sat beside him, bathing his face, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips, holding him down when the nightmares threatened to tear his wounds open. She was no longer a teacher. She was no longer a widow. She was a nurse, a guardian, a confessor. She was the only thing tethering him to the world. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. She awoke from a stiff, brief sleep in the chair, her head on his cot. The cabin was cold. She sat up, panicked. The silence, it was too quiet. She looked at him. He was still, and he was watching her. His good eye was clear. It was the blue she remembered, sharp and intelligent. "Clara," he rasped. His voice was a dry whisper. She burst into tears, a relief so profound it was painful. She gripped his hand, bringing it to her lips. "You're back. Oh, Elias, you're back. The water," he whispered. She helped him drink, his head heavy in her arm. He drank deeply, greedily. He looked around the cabin, his eyes taking in the barred door, the Spencer rifle leaning against the wall, the bloody rags in the basin. They're gone. They're gone," she said, her voice firm. "Mac, the other 2, they're gone. It's over." He closed his eye, a deep, shuddering breath leaving him. The soldier was gone. The man remained. You saved me. We saved each other," she said, smoothing the hair back from his damp forehead. "Now, you just heal." He healed slowly. The winter was deep, the world locked in snow. His body, strong as it was, had been pushed to its limit. For the first week, he could not stand. Clara fed him, cleaned him, and read to him from her books. She read Shakespeare, her voice filling the small, warm cabin. A strange, gentle sound after so much violence. He listened, his eyes closed, his hand in hers. Outside, the world pretended nothing had happened. The snow, which had been a shroud, became a problem. The bodies were still out there. On the 5th day, a man on horseback arrived. Not from the town. It was Eli's father, Mr. Miller, the settler whose barn had been burned. He was a tall, thin man with a hard face and quiet eyes. He carried a rifle and a shovel. He knocked on Clara's door. Elias, from the bed, grabbed his pistol, his hand still weak. Clara put a hand on his chest. "It's all right," she said. She opened the door. "Mr." Miller looked at her. He did not look surprised. He looked at the floor, then at her. "Ma'am, heard some shooting the other night." "Yes," Clara said. "Figured as much." He said. He looked past her, into the cabin, and saw the shape of Elias in the bed. He did not comment. He just nodded, as if a question had been answered. "The boy, Eli, he said you were in trouble. I was coming, but the snow, they came." Clara said, We handled it." "Mister." Miller looked out at the clearing. The snow had drifted, but the shapes were still there. I see that," He hefted his shovel. Figured you might need a hand. The ground's hard, but the creek, it's still soft at the bend. Things disappear. He did not ask what happened. He did not ask who fired. He did not ask for a confession or an explanation. He just went to work. He spent the day. Him and his 2 large sons, who arrived an hour later. They were silent. Grim-faced men. They dug. They hauled. They cleaned. When they were done, the clearing was just the clearing. The snow was smooth. The 3 outlaws were gone. Before he left, Miller stood on our porch, his hat in his hands. The town, they ain't worth your time, ma'am. Brody, he's a coward. But us folks, out here, we're grateful. My Eli, he can read. You did that. He left a freshly dressed deer on her porch. The town did not come. No sheriff, no investigator, no preacher. The word had filtered back, carried by the wind. 3 men, Mac's whole gang, had vanished. The teacher's school was burned, but she was still there. And so was the wild man. Hallow Ridge, a town built on a fragile truce with the wilderness. Understood. It was a problem that had solved itself. It was a wound that had been cauterized. They were terrified, and they were grateful. And so, they pretended nothing had happened. They pretended the forest had simply swallowed the bad men, and they went on with their lives. Their fear of the woods now mingled with a new, quiet respect. Clara, they decided, was not a whore. She was something else, something dangerous, something to be left alone. As Elias grew stronger, he began to sit up, then to walk, his hand on the wall. He carved, to pass the time, to keep his hands busy. He carved small, intricate birds from scraps of pine. The children came back. It was a week before Christmas. Clara heard a shuffling on the porch. She opened the door to find Eli and Beth and the other 7. They were standing in the snow, their faces red with cold, holding a string of pine boughs and dried berries. We ain't got a school," Eli said, his voice small. "No," Clara said, her throat tight. "But we still got you," Beth said, holding up the pine. Clara let them in. The cabin was warm, and it was small, but they crowded around the fire, their eyes wide. They looked at Elias, who sat in the corner, his scarred face unreadable, a knife and a piece of wood in his hand. He was the ghost from their parents' stories. He just nodded at them, a single, curt dip of his chin. Clara began to teach again. From her cabin, she had no slate, so she used the floor, drawing letters in the ash. She had her books. She taught them sums. She taught them reading. And in the corner, the scarred mountain man sat, and he carved, and he listened. The families, one by one, began to show their gratitude. They did not come with thanks. They came with payment. One day, she would find a sack of flour on her porch. The next, a pile of split firewood. Mrs. Miller, Eli's mother, brought a thick, warm quilt and 3 jars of preserved peaches. "It ain't much," she said, not meeting Clara's eyes. "But we'd be proud if you'd take it, for the young'uns, for what you did." It was an apology. It was an acceptance. It was the only one she would ever get. Elias stayed hidden. The children were the only ones who saw him. To them, he was not a savage. He was just Mr. Elias, the quiet man who carved them small wooden animals, a bear for Beth, a wolf for Eli. At night, when the children were gone, when the cabin was small and warm and theirs, they talked of the future. The violence was behind them, a scar, like the ones on his face, like the one on her heart. Now, there was just life. "We should go," Elias said one night. He was staring into the fire, his side aching in the cold. "North, like I said, Canada, we have enough." "The cash is still there. We could find a valley, a place with no memory." He was offering her the dream again. A quiet lake, a cabin of their own, a new name, a new life. Clara watched him. He had healed. His body was strong again, but his soul was still a fugitive. He was still the man who had been betrayed, the man with a bounty on his head. He still saw himself as the ghost. She stood from her chair and went to him, kneeling on the hearth, as she had done before. She took his hand, the large, scarred hand, and held it. "I don't want to run anymore. Elias," she said, her voice soft, but as strong as the new door. He looked at her, confused. "Clara, this ain't a life. Hiding, always looking over your shoulder. That bounty, it's still out there. Rooker, he's a colonel now. I heard he'd never let me be. And you deserve more than this." "What is this?" she asked. "A warm home, a job I love, even if it's in my own cabin. Food, a community that, in its own way, respects me." She smiled, a small, sad smile. "They're terrified of me, Elias, and it's wonderful. And I have you." "You have a monster," he said. "The old words, the old shame." "No," she said, her grip tightening. "I have a man who came out of the shadows for me, a man who faced down his own ghosts for me, a man who gave me my life back." She took a deep breath. "I don't want to go to Canada. I don't want to find a new valley. This is our valley. We bought it. We paid for it. In blood and in fire. It's ours." He was silent. He saw the strength in her, the strength he had always admired. But now, it was a strength that was holding him still. "Elias," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I want to marry you." He recoiled, as if she had struck him. "Marry? Clara, look at me. I have no name. I have no standing. The law wants to hang me." "What preacher? What church?" "I don't care about a church," she said, her eyes shining with a fierce, bright light. "I don't care about a preacher. My father was a preacher. He spoke of God. But I saw what God's good people did to me in that town. They are hypocrites and cowards." She put her other hand on his scarred cheek. "I don't need their blessing. I don't need the law's blessing. I need yours. I want to promise myself to you, and I want you to promise yourself to me. Here, tonight, by this fire, in this home that we built. That is the only wedding I want." Elias looked at her, his throat thick. He had been a captain. He had been a scout. He had been a hermit. He had been a killer. But no one, in his entire broken life, had ever seen him. Not like this. Not for what he was. I have nothing to give you, Clara," he whispered, his voice broken. "No ring, no name. You have everything." She said. She pulled the thin, gold band from her left hand, the ring Robert had given her. She had worn it for a year, a symbol of her grief. Now, it was just a symbol of the past, a past she was ready to release. "I don't want to forget him," she said, her voice trembling. "He was good, but he's gone, and I am here." She held the ring in her open palm. This is from my past. It's all I have. I want you to have it, as a promise." Elias looked at the ring, shining in her hand. He took it. It was so small, so delicate. He closed his large fist around it. He then reached into his own shirt. He pulled a leather thong from around his neck. On it was a small, dark object. It was a piece of wood, carved with his knife. It was one of his birds, an eagle, its wings spread, carved with an intricacy that must have taken him weeks. I made this," he said, his voice rough. "I made it for you. When I was healing, I didn't know why." He took the thong from his neck and placed it, gently, around hers. The carved wood was warm from his skin. It settled between her breasts, a small, strong, secret thing. Elias Thorne," he said, his voice, for the first time, clear and strong, with no trace of the ghost. "I promise myself to you, my life, my strength, my name. What's left of it, it's all yours, until the end. And I, Clara Hayes," she said, tears streaming down her face. I promise myself to you, my heart, my home, my life. It is yours, always. He did not kiss her. He just held her, his forehead against hers. Two people, bound by a vow stronger than any law, by a fire that was all their own. Spring arrived. It came not as a gentle thing, but as a violent, cracking thaw. The snow melted, the ridges turned from white to brown. The creek, which had been a whisper, became a roar. The forest, which had been asleep, awoke. Clara packed a small bag, flour, salt, coffee. "Where are you going?" Elias asked, his hand, as always, on his rifle. "To town," she said. He tensed. "Clara, no, there's no need." "There is," she said. "I need thread, and I need to see." She put on her gray wool dress. She put the carved eagle inside her blouse, a secret warmth against her skin. "I am not afraid. Elias, you taught me not to be." She walked the 5 miles. The track was muddy, but the air was sweet with pine and damp earth. She did not look over her shoulder. She did not listen for footsteps. She was not a victim. She was not a widow. She was Clara Thorne. She walked into Hollow Ridge. The town stopped. It was the same as the first day, but entirely different. The men on the boardwalk, the same ones who had leered, stopped talking. They looked at her. They looked at her with a new, profound respect, awe, and a great deal of fear. They tipped their hats, not slowly, not with insinuation, but with a curt, quick gesture of respect. "Ma'am," one of them mumbled, stepping off the boardwalk into the mud to let her pass. The women, Mrs. Miller and the others, were outside the mercantile. They saw her coming. They did not whisper. They did not smirk. They looked down, as if abashed, and hurried inside. She walked into the mercantile. The room fell silent. Sheriff Brody was there, in the corner, buying tobacco. He saw her. His face went pale. He paid his money and left, walking out the back way. Clara walked to the counter. "Mr. Croft, the school board man, was there. He looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Mrs. Hayes," he stammered. "Mrs. Thorne," she corrected him, her voice quiet, but carrying in the silent room. "I need 2 spools of black thread and a pound of coffee." He fumbled with her order, his hands shaking. He wrapped it. That'll be 22 cents. Clara placed the coins on the counter. She met his gaze, and he withered. She took her package. She turned and walked out. She walked, chin high, through the center of the town that had scorned her. She was not running. She was not hiding. She was the woman who had survived. And in the trees, on the ridge above the town, a man watched. He was not a ghost. He was not a rumor. He was a sentinel. He watched her, small and strong, her dark dress moving through the muddy street. He watched her clear the last building. He watched her take the track back to the woods, back to him. He was never far, but he was no longer hiding. He met her at the edge of their clearing. He did not step from the shadows. He was waiting for her, in the sun. She smiled, a bright, true smile. "It's a lovely day, Mr. Thorne." He took her hand, his scarred, calloused grip, and her small, strong one. "Aye," he said, his voice, his real voice. "It is Mrs. Thorne." They walked through the woods, hand in hand. The past was behind them, a scar that had healed. The future was unwritten, a valley they had not yet seen, but it was, at last, a future that was shared. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We truly hope you enjoyed it. We would love to know where in the world you're listening from, so please drop a comment and let us know. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to From Wild West. And finally, we'd be so grateful if you'd share your thoughts on the story. Please leave a comment in English. We read every single one. Until next time.